Coming up next, CityNet 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Well, I mean, I think it's got other reasons.
I'm treasurer of City Club, standing in for Nancy Hadid today.
Thank you.
Afternoon. Sit down. Good afternoon. Aha, okay.
No matter how much you get.
I'm David Kish, treasurer of City Club, standing in for Nancy Hadid today, who's our, or standing in for Harriet Watson today, who's our club president, who couldn't be with us today. Today we have a very special program. We focus on the status and the meaning of the recent elections, the 2000 elections, if we know the status and the meaning of those two elections, with two of Portland's very well-known pundits, Lars Larson, talk show host with KXL, and David Sarasohn, associate editor of the Oregonian. Before we start, I've got a few announcements. First, I'd like to welcome Kathy Park. Is Kathy in the audience? Kathy is a new member who's Associate Vice President for Development at Lewis and Clark College. Next week, Friday, November 17th, join us for a first-hand testimonial on how and why sustainable business practices work for Portland. With us will be John Emmerich, CEO of Norm Thompson Company, and Derek Smith, Sustainability Manager for Norm Thompson, Inc., and that will be here at the Mac Club. Please note that the bulletin has recently included an additional member pledge card for this year's annual fund drive. I welcome both members and non-members alike to please join us in supporting the important work of the club. To date, we've raised about $62,000 toward our goal of $90,000. If you haven't already given a card to one of the members or made a pledge, please do so, or you can hand it to a staff member on the way out. Our board host today, sitting at the podium here, is Dan Finley, board member of City Club and a computer specialist with RHAS Company. He will ask the first question of our two speakers. And I also want to give a special thanks to Linda Hawkins, Tim Rooney, and Jason Tate of Portland Cable Access for providing sound and television today. OPB is celebrating Veterans Day and is off today on holiday. Following Dan's question, we'll open the program to questions from City Club members in the audience. Please line up behind the microphone even before Dan is done so that you'll have time to ask as many questions as possible. Identify yourself as a City Club member and ask questions that are no more than 30 seconds in duration. Broadcast of the club program this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from the following companies: Pacific Care, Pope & Talbot, and Zimmer Gunsel Frasca. We're very thankful and grateful for their support. Now the program. The election is over and the voters have spoken. Maybe it's not over. But what did they say? Or as columnist Ellen Goodman said today, the voters have spoken, but what language did they speak? With us today are two of Portland's best-known media personalities. Lars Larson has been in broadcasting for 24 years and has won over 70 awards, including a Peabody Award and an Emmy. He's worked for 3 television stations in the Northwest and over a dozen radio stations, and currently hosts a live afternoon talk show on KXL Radio 750. David Sarasohn, an associate editor with the Oregonian. His regular columns in the Oregonian provide us with insightful comments on the issues we face in society, wrapped in a sense of humor for which Mr. Sarasohn has become famous. His awards include a 1995 Best in the West Columnist Award, a 1995 Freedom of Expression Award from the ACLU, and a 2000 award from the Oregon Food Bank for being a hunger buster. Each of these individuals will speak for 10 minutes, followed by some discussion back and forth between those two, followed by questions and answers from the podium. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Sarasohn and Mr. Larson.
Well, If anybody here knows more about this than I do at the moment, please come on up, because it has been at least 15 minutes since I've seen a TV set, and the whole world may have changed. But I'm pleased to be here today, and I hope I can be of some use on this subject. All of us on the editorial board take all knowledge for our province, but we do have specialties, just as one of us specializes in BPA and one of us specializes in light rail. For a long time now, I've been the Oregonian editorial board specialist on Florida election law. And this has been very useful because Florida has this very complicated system which takes a long time to get a result, unlike Oregon's new cutting-edge system. I've never felt that we had such a bond with the folks over in the far end of the country from this entire week that we have spent together outlined in yellow. It makes sense for the Floridians to be yellow with the sunshine and the oranges, and how we got it. I mean, we ended up, of course, with half the duck colors and the wrong half. So, but what we have heard a great deal, over the past 4 days is the various unhappy people from Palm Beach County and the suggestion from the Bush people that this all makes perfect sense because in voting districts occupied almost entirely by retired Jews from New York and New Jersey, there's actually a strong hotbed of Pat Buchanan sentiment. And I saw in one morning, Carl Hiaasen is a columnist for the Miami Herald, and he said that he was personally finding this hard to believe because he knew that district, and in that district, Yasser Arafat would outpoll Pat Buchanan. So. Now, what I did want to do for just a little bit today is try to take a somewhat broader view of this and about some other things which shaped this election and some things which may have had more of an effect than even 4,000 votes in Palm Beach County. And actually, watching the television coverage this past week, I mean, what I basically had was the feeling that we were focusing on the wrong angry Jewish woman. That this was still fundamentally the election of Monica, more than it was the election of the Palm Beach election supervisor. And if you consider what has actually shaped this election, what has brought us to the point of this kind of razor-edge division, it's because of this shadow that has gone across Gore and the difficulty he had through the entire year in making the case that at a time of extraordinary prosperity and peace, why he needed to continue. And in fact, because of this, he was virtually paralyzed, and he was paralyzed in two great ways, which people were talking about, Democrats were talking about a lot throughout October, and we'll be talking about a lot more if this thing is resolved and Bush is elected. He was paralyzed in a way, first, that he never felt he could use Clinton, because every time Clinton appeared, people would say, "Here's Clinton." And, he would end up losing people that he needed for it. And he was paralyzed more than that, in that he never successfully made the case of how well things were going. The idea that we'd been successful for 8 years and the deal was to continue that. Now, Clinton, he goes out, he does, 1, 2, 3 fundraisers a day, and it always begins the same way. He always says, in 1992, the country was in this shape. Now the country is in this shape. And Gore was always unwilling to do that because he thought it would remind people whose vice president he'd been for the past 8 years. So he ended up with a situation where he was trying to at once take credit for the situation and second, have this sort of angry populism about the things he was going to change. And somebody once, distilled Gore's message here as saying, "We have the greatest economy in history, and I'm mad as hell about it." So he ended up with this kind of mixed message and this kind of fuzzy, this is the great word of the 2000 election, fuzzy. And he ended up with this fuzzy dialogue, which is one reason why he never connected. In Bush turned out, I think, to be a great candidate for the year 2000 because this election is ending in confusion, and it sort of fits right in with the campaign he was running. People are talking about how you've got to run this election over in Palm Beach County because the ballot was confusing. And, someday someone's going to back off and say, well, we can look at the debates and George Bush's explanation of how his prescription drug program worked, and were more voters confused by that or by the Palm Beach ballot? And he ended up losing considerable ground at the end because of two events which were small in themselves, but which tended to confirm impressions and worries that people had about him. The first was the report of the drunken driving arrest, which was a long time back, but Larry Sabato at the University of Virginia always says that in any kind of political scandal, there's always a subtext. It always confirms something people already suspected. So basically, the DWI arrest, if you were someone who basically felt that George Bush was sort of a chuckle-headed frat boy, this is going to fit into all of your concerns. And then there was his dramatic announcement on the Thursday before the election that Al Gore seemed to think that Social Security was some kind of federal program. Now, for most people, this would be considered a slip of the tongue. And for George W. Bush, though, people stopped and wondered, did he actually know how this was? And, this had an effect. We could see in polls over that entire last weekend, there was this slight movement, toward Gore. And this was fueled, I think, by these two efforts. And this is what led us into this present, unfortunate situation, which, can make you think that it would have been nicer if George Bush had kept his thoughts about Social Security to himself, and he could be president now and we could have a simpler life. People keep asking me now, what I think is going to happen. And, this is easy for me because I've been telling people for 3 weeks I didn't know what was going to happen. The one thing that I wasn't telling people was that I didn't know that a week after the election I didn't know what was going to happen. But while I can't give you a solution, going to offer you now two scenarios. Scenarios that I'm fond of, which are as likely as anything else that's going to happen here. The first is what I call Bush-Lieberman. Now, you're going to follow this closely. Some of you may want to get out pencils. But, you know, it starts with Maria Cantwell being elected to the Senate from Washington, which gives the Senate a 50-50 split. And of course, the Republicans are going to narrowly control the House. Now, when the next Congress meets January 6th to open and consider the electoral vote, Al Gore is still going to be presiding over the Senate. So for 2 weeks, there will be narrowly a Democratic Senate. So you have a Democratic Senate, you have a Republican House, and when the returns come in from Florida, somebody refuses to accept them. So if the Electoral College doesn't come up with a deal, it moves to the next part of the constitutional step, which is the House electing a president and the Senate electing a vice president. So this new narrowly Republican... Please. You know, this new narrowly Republican House elects George Bush president, and the temporarily narrowly Republican Senate elects Joe Lieberman vice president. And of course, you know, we have a mixed government where the president eats barbecue and the vice president doesn't. But I have another scenario for you. And this one is, you know, maybe slightly more complicated, but basically it involves what seems now the likelihood that the Florida result sets off a wave of recounts, and that, you know, Gore's narrow majorities hold up in Wisconsin and Iowa and New Mexico, and that there's a switch in New Hampshire, which is a fairly narrow turn, and there will be a recount there, probably not enough to turn it over. But Bush does eke out a win in Florida. This, however, leaves us with Oregon. And Gore, who already has 264 electoral votes, then gets the missing additional ones he needs from Oregon, which it now seems he's going to carry by about 1,000 or 1,200 votes. And he's going to carry Oregon, and this part is actually true. He's going to carry Oregon because of measures on the ballot, which caused a huge increase in union voting and caused every gay in the state of Oregon to come to the polls. So this is the scenario in which Bill Sizemore and Lon Mabon make Al Gore president. Now, it's possible that you know, somebody could consider either of these options a little bit weird. But you know, I have now been in this campaign you know, from New Hampshire and the primaries and 2 conventions and a debate and straight on to Palm Beach County. And my question is, weirder than what? Thank you.
Lars Larson.
Good afternoon. Thanks a lot for inviting me here. It affords me a really rare opportunity, and that is to sit slightly to the left of David Sarasohn. which at times I've thought, as I read his column, I thought was absolutely impossible. But it's a great pleasure to be here. It's also interesting to talk about this race because I've spent the last 2 days, usually in the talk show that I do for KXL, in the mornings, we'll switch topics about once an hour. In the last 3 days, we haven't switched topics once. It has been Florida and the vote and what's going to happen. I will tell you that while I've been painted as a Republican or conservative ideologue, I'm not. I don't vote party line. In fact, I had to look at one race and cast my ballot for Congressman Wu because the other candidate wasn't as good. He was a Republican, but he wasn't as good. And there might be a few other votes from my ballot that might surprise you, but I will keep those to myself. As for what's going to happen, it's always interesting to see how the newspaper covers things because we had the experience a while back of having 2 presidential candidates. Actually, it was 3 presidential candidates in town at one time on one day because Al Gore was here in the morning, and George Bush was here in the afternoon, and Harry Brown arrived in the early evening. And I got a chance to talk to 2 of them. Al Gore never seemed to want to call my program, but he did talk to the 2 comedians who follow me in the afternoon. And what I thought was interesting was our radio reporter who covered the Al Gore event said that she had done a rough count and that there were 250 people in the hall. The Associated Press had it at 300. The front page of the Oregonian had it at 400, which is 50 more than Dan Moriarty, the president of Portland Community College, says will fit in the hall. And Mr. Sarasohn had it at 500. So let it never be said that facts should get in the way of a good story.
In the sports section, we had it at 6.
Did you really? It's a good thing. Those sports reporters, they'll do anything to kiss up to the coach. The reason I raised this is not to be mean to David, but because I'd like to inject a few facts into the mix. We are watching to see what happens in Florida. I think that most Americans, no matter which political stripe you're of, would reject the idea of a revote, especially a revote in one county, in one state, in this country, already knowing the results. With all the attendant problems of, do you let everybody in that county vote, or just the ones who voted Tuesday? Do you let all of them change their vote, or just the ones who voted for Buchanan? Do you let the Naderites say, well, I already got my Ralph Nader vote in, I might as well get a Gore vote in, I've got a twofer? Do you let some of the people who were angry at Al Gore and voted for George Bush out of revenge go back and vote for Gore instead? And on and on and on. But let me throw some facts at you. Because while it's funny to laugh about a largely Jewish population voting for somebody like Pat Buchanan, you have to think about the facts. I know that facts sometimes get in the way of a great column, but in Palm Beach County, there is, for some reason, a couple of reasons that are easily identifiable, the fact that Pat Buchanan used to live there, that his cousin lives there, and that about 11,000 people in that county are registered as members of his party or parties that might identify with him. That's one fact. A second fact is that he got 8,000 votes in the Republican primary, or in the primary election. And you really kind of have to wonder, if he got 8,000 votes before in that county, and that was an unusual showing in Florida, why couldn't he get 3,600 votes in the general? Just a question. You look back at his results in '96 and you see a similar kind of comparison. So I want us to get back to some facts, because an awful lot of what you're hearing every night, depending on what you're watching, what you're reading, and what you're listening to, may not be either factual or it may not be contextual. Let me give you an example. You hear, for instance, that 19,000 ballots were thrown out because they were double punched. They were faulty. And you think, wow, that's a lot of ballots in one county. But let me add some context. In that same area in 1996, 15,000 ballots were thrown out, and there's been a dramatic increase in registration. In the state of Florida this year, 140,000 ballots were thrown out. And in other states, Oregon doesn't suffer from it as much anymore because we have a mail ballot that makes it a lot easier to sit down and carefully consider it. We don't have to deal with the butterfly ballot. And by the way, speaking of the butterfly ballot, everybody know what I'm talking about? The famous Palm Beach butterfly ballot? One of the other famous places they use that is in Mayor Daley's town. And the funniest line I heard was that The people in Chicago and in Illinois say, but we don't use the butterfly ballot for anything important. We only elect judges with it. But they do use the ballot, and I was here getting emails and phone calls all morning from people who said, we used to use it here in Oregon and had no problem with it, and if somebody went in and mismarked it, they were simply given another ballot, and it was replaced. But what you're hearing is that somehow, A, the evidence is that the Buchanan votes show that people must have accidentally voted for Buchanan when they meant to vote for Gore, although apparently they filled out the rest of their ballot flawlessly. Then you hear that the ballot's illegal. And it is illegal if you only read the first part of the election law in Florida. And I know David's an expert on this. The first part of the election law says that you have to have the words, and my choice for this office is, or words to that effect, and then there's an X, a place where you mark an X to the right, and it must be to the right of those words in the candidate's name. That's the part of the law that was written for the paper ballot. Then they added to the law, because along came computers and punched ballots, and they said, let's add to that and allow them to put the mark on either the left side or the right side of the candidate's name, but you have to read that far in the law, and some reporters simply haven't done that. That's another piece that's out of context. A piece that's out of context that you might be thinking about now is, well, George W. is 326 or 329. I think I actually saw it dip down a couple of points right before I left the station at noon. He's 329 ahead, but think about all those absentees. And somebody walking through the Coin newsroom, one of our producers, walked up to me and said, do you know how many absentees there are? I said, no, but I'll bet I can find out. So I got on the web and I went to the Miami Herald's webpage. Now, again, while newspapers aren't the be-all and end-all for information, they tend to be generally accurate. And the Miami Herald estimates that somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 absentees were sent out. And that's consistent with 96, because in 96, they got back 2,300. A lot higher interest in this one, so perhaps it went as high as 3,000. So they looked at individual counties. I know I'm not going to say this right. Volusia County sent out 434 absentee ballots. On election night, they counted 300 of them, almost 75%. So I know that a lot of you are pinning your hopes for Al Gore on the absentees, but it sounds like they sent out about 3,000 of them, and roughly 75% of them are back. And of the 600 or 700 that might arguably still be out there, an awful lot are going to come from military folks overseas who don't think much of Al Gore. In fact, I got an email yesterday from a gentleman who said, I'm stationed in a U.S. military base in Japan, and he says, I have a lot of different soldiers who are serving with me. And he said they are of different colors and they are of different genders, and he says, I don't know of a one of them that would vote for Al Gore. There are even some Democrats, but none of them would vote for Al Gore. And I'll wrap it up and sit down and shut up and answer questions in a moment, but first I wanted to tell you this. The funniest email I got today was from a gentleman who wrote in and said, I can't understand how Floridians who can't handle a ballot, like that little butterfly punch ballot, can juggle 9 bingo cards at the same time. Thank you very much.
Before we move to questions and answers, let's have a little cross-commentary by the two speakers today. David, did you have things you wanted to add to either your presentation or Lars?
Well, I think we can get more deeply into this question of Florida election law as we draw on the years that Lars and I spent practicing law in Tallahassee. This is the missing parts of our years. I think that there are various questions about this and where it goes. I don't think we're going to end up with this thing being tossed out and having a revote. For all of the reasons, Lars suggests about them, why this county gets to vote again. This isn't stickball. We don't have redos. We don't have do-overs. You get what you get. In terms of what's there, nobody knows what's there. There's probably not a vast amount coming over. I actually saw someone on television yesterday who was a black Floridian in Kosovo who said he had mailed in his vote for Gore. But, and that wasn't in the newspaper, so you can trust it. So anyway, that's one. No, there's also, aspects to this about people overseas who are not in the military. There's about people from Dade and Palm Beach counties who are making extended visits to their children in Israel. Now, I don't actually think that Al Gore is going to be elected president in heavy voting from Tel Aviv. But there's weird things out there. And I mean, the thing that I think is actually going to be more interesting about this is what happens when the three big counties do their hand count, and which should be fascinating. Apparently, a hand count consists of an election worker holding the ballot up to the light, and three judges discuss what the voter meant to do.
400,000 times.
400,000 times. And, through the simple process of just, sending the ballots through the computers one more time, 5/6 of George Bush's lead disappeared. So what happens when they actually look at them, I don't know. Thank you.
The interesting thing about that, too, that I would add to what David said is that, as I understand it, the hand count will also include ballots that were allegedly circled in pencil. Somebody who decided to invent a new way to use the butterfly ballot, and that those will then be interpreted by an elections worker and then awarded to the candidate of the elections worker or judge's choice. That's a truly frightening prospect. And then you think about the fact that the man representing Al Gore in all this is William Daley. And it just leaves all kinds of room open for craziness that shouldn't be happening at all. And I really question the Vice President's judgment. I understand that he wants to wait for the last little bit to come through. I'm reminded of a city election where I stood there with Frank Ivancy at midnight and said, all right, you've got this, I can't even remember the percentage, it was huge, and 50% of the vote was in. And he'd said earlier in the evening that he would declare victory when he had 50% in and had a convincing lead. Got to 50, he said no, 60. And he kept bumping it up. And about 4 in the morning, we hit 90% of the vote. And finally, he was willing to say that he was fairly confident he would become the city's next mayor. I think that Al Gore can be fairly confident he's not going to become the next president of the United States at this point. I think that the absentees are going to push it farther in Bush's favor. And all of these arguments about we're going to challenge the vote. I mean, look at, was it Wisconsin or Iowa that's 1.2 million and 5,000 votes separating the two. Do we recount that one? There'll probably be an automatic recount. And do we then start to throw all of this up in the air? Do we let the stock market go crazy for a few more days? Do we push it off to the official certification date in Florida, which is a week from today? Do we push it off to the end of the challenge period, which is 10 days after that, the 27th of November? Do we push it off to the state's response to the last possible challenge date, which is sometime in early December? Or do we push it off far enough that the Electoral College will get together and meet and nobody will have 270 votes and it'll go to the House?
Well, as Jon Stewart pointed out today on the Today Show, I mean, the interesting thing is that the people who are demanding that this thing must be resolved immediately are also the people who thought Whitewater needed to be investigated for 5 years.
I'll tell you what, does anybody in this room, I'm serious, would anybody raise their hand if they believed that the then governor of Arkansas and his wife weren't offered an opportunity to make a large amount of money, which turned out to be a bogus opportunity, and that they tried to take advantage of it? Does anybody believe they weren't offered an opportunity to make a lot of money in Whitewater and it just didn't pan out?
Lars, that's Senator Wife to you.
What? Senator what?
That's Senator Wife to you.
Did you see the videotape of her shoving him aside to grab Chuck Schumer's hand the other day?
We have a situation here where our guests are asking us questions. Have us ask them questions.
Nobody raised their hand, though.
I would invite Dan Finley, board member, to the podium to ask the first question, followed by questions from the audience.
Actually, this is a wonderful thing to happen, because can you remember a time in a major national election where Oregon was more than just a footnote? We get to hear about ourselves on the news every night, and we could be the pivotal state. And talking about David's scenario number 2, those of you who are familiar with the official song of the state of Oregon, we could literally be land of the empire builders. My question is this. This doesn't come up a great deal except as anecdotal references, but the Electoral College is going to be involved in any election. Certainly in this particular case, it could prove to be an interesting thing to see how the Electoral College pans out as they consider the way that the nation has voted. And one thing that perhaps a lot of people aren't aware of is that certain states don't necessarily bind their electors to follow the consent given by the voters in that state. So if it does go to the Electoral College, then what?
Well, I know that they don't bind them, but I had to be educated a bit on this week, and I talked to a couple of people about it, and they said, Lars, you don't understand the kind of people who are picked as electors. Now, some of them have gone seriously off the rails, like the guy who voted on '88 to make Lloyd Benson president and Michael Dukakis vice president. And there was one in Washington State in '76 or in '76. But the fact is that if any of you know Lou Barris, who's quite conservative, it's hard for me to imagine Lou Barris or somebody like him from the Democratic side, depending on where Oregon goes, changing his vote and saying, oh, no, the popular will of the people must rule, and I will cast my Electoral College vote for Al Gore. I don't think it'll happen, and I don't think it would happen from the people who are electors from those states that gave their votes to Al Gore. Maybe you have a different take on that.
No, I suspect that's true. I mean, I think that electors are going to vote in a case, where it matters for the person they were chosen by their state. There are 20 states, I gather, that legally require it, although actually you can't legally require it. You can just prosecute someone afterwards. So, which would also fit into this election. But I mean, I think basically the two candidates are going to receive the full electoral votes of any electors who plan to return to their states.
Our first question from the floor.
Hi, I'm Corleen Kraft, member of the City Club and a member of the Program Committee. And when we extended the invitation to you two learned gentlemen to attend this luncheon today, we had no idea that we would have such an interesting cliffhanger on our hands and have so much to talk about on the national level. But I'm wondering if you would each spend a little bit of time giving us some commentary and some predictions on state and local issues, matters, elections.
Well, I think in terms of initiatives, it was, by and large, a heartening result. I think people looked at these things, people made plausible decisions. I think one of the aspects of 26 things on the ballot is that some measures did get squeezed around, but by and large, it wasn't a bad outcome. I think in terms of the legislature is going to be even narrower, even closer. I do think that the legislature may be a somewhat more congenial and place and a little easier to deal with. I think we've had a process which they call in the sports locker room addition by subtraction. In that, I think we've lost some people, especially from the state senate, who have made this a somewhat bitterer process. So I think, by and large, it was a reasonably good outcome, and it was an outcome fueled, as I mentioned before, by this considerable turnout of union people and maximized turnout of gay voters.
One of the most important things I thought on the ballot was 7, and the fact that it passed, because it changes the fundamental relationship between Oregon government and the people who live here in one very important way. In fact, I had a call from a gentleman this morning who said, listen, he was at a meeting last evening, a local government meeting, and there were proposals to add some new restrictions to land use, and the first thing that came up was, well, if you're going to restrict my use of my land, this may cost you some money. And in the past, the relationship has always been a one-way relationship. That is, we can take whatever we want, that is, we government can take whatever we want, whether there's a good public purpose for it or not, whether there's a public purpose that's merited by the expense to you, the landowner, or not. It doesn't have to matter. You can tell a man who's got a few acres that if there's a little piece of water running through his land that has no fish in it, that you can restrict his ability to build within 200 feet of the stream, even if that means that he can't build much of anything on it, because if you don't take 100% of its value, then the courts say you haven't taken anything at all and you don't owe him a dime. 7 changes that relationship, and I think it does it in a positive way. All the scare tactics that were employed, the usual sky is falling, Barbara Roberts, we're going to die kind of predictions that were made about 7, just as they were made about 5 and a lot of other ballot measures, are not going to come true for a couple of very simple reasons. The first is that it will change that relationship. Local governments and state government will have to say, if we're going to change the rules for people's use of their property, it better be worthwhile. And the measure of whether it's worthwhile is it worth the cash? In other words, if we decide that it's worth something, that it's an important thing to do to hold people back from the edge of their property by 10 feet or 100 feet or 200 feet, then we better be ready to pay for it. And if we can't pay for it, then it isn't, by definition, worth it. And that's a very simple equation that you practice every single day. You see something you'd like. You look at it, you look at the price tag and say, is it worth it to me? Is it important enough? And having that relationship changes everything. I've always laughed about the fact that state government requires now, only fairly recently, that fiscal impact statements be written about all new legislation. The problem is, they never write one for us. They say, what's this going to do to government? Nobody writes a fiscal impact statement that says, if we pass this rule, what's it going to do to the people who live in this state? This forces them to take account of the fiscal impact and not just simply pass restrictions left and right that impact people adversely without any kind of acknowledgement of the costs. And this is going to be a real acknowledgement. It'll be a check.
Hi, Gil Johnson, City Club member. I have a question for both of you. I read the Oregonian in the morning, and then on my way to pick up the kids from school, I listen to talk radio. And if the information is not the same, somewhere the truth is out there, but it's not the same, even though in the last month it's been on the same topics. So I'd like you to both compare and contrast how your medium and the other one affected the outcome of the elections, particularly the local things like Measure 7. I'll give David another shot at that. But I'd like to also ask Mr. Sarasohn, given the nature of the Oregonians' editorial endorsements, which backed primarily Democrats and opposed primarily reactionary measures, and then endorsed Governor Bush, does the ghost of Harvey Scott appear every 4 years at the Oregonian to write the presidential editorial endorsement?
You know, I've always wondered who that guy was in the back of the room, you know. You know, I would just say that, you know, the presidential endorsement speaks for itself. And next to this question of you know, what's going to happen and who's going to win, the second most common question I've been asked about this in the last month is, do you people vote on these things? And no, we don't. So it reflects the sense of the paper as discerned by the editor of the editorial page. You know, in terms of our impact on the election, you know, by and large, the people we endorsed won. This may be coincidental. You know, we like to think it's not entirely coincidental. I also think that, you know, we managed not only in editorial but in news side to put out a great deal of information on all of these things. And, you know, we're very pleased about the voters pamphlet that we put out in the weeks end before the ballots were mailed out. So, you know, I like to think we've had sort of a useful effect on the outcome.
Erwin Mandel, City Club member. To keep the shift in focus from the arguably nationally ridiculous to the arguably locally sublime, That's good, I blanked. Would you like to comment, considering that we've had apparently a record turnout of voters in this election, would you like to comment on the Sizemore effect on our balloting? You know, it might very well have been positive.
It was positive in the sense of increasing turnout, but it was probably negative and changed a number of races that might have gone differently if you had not had largely conservative ballot measures. I know they've been described as reactionary. I'm not sure I'd necessarily agree with that description, but some of them, which were very conservative, that drew out a large union and liberal vote, Democratic vote, if you will, that then changed the outcome of some of those races. I think that I wouldn't describe it as positive or negative. What I worry about more, and let me add to that a bit, the reporting by people in my business, television and radio from the East Coast, that I think spurred an enormous outpouring of people late on Election Day in reaction in part to first the fact that Florida had been given to Gore and then Florida was taken away from Gore before the closing of our polls. And if any of you watched the video that night of huge lines of people lining up around election headquarters in metropolitan areas, waiting to vote at the last minute, you know, forcing the county to say, we're going to put a sheriff's deputy out there who will cut the line off at the stroke of 8 and allow people to vote as late as 9:30. Even changing addresses and things like that. People who had clearly not intended to vote probably until they got home or until they were sitting in front of a TV or listening to the radio. And I worry about that effect on our electoral process. That's something that will have to be solved at the national level, and there's some good, slick ways of doing it, but I'm not sure we'll do it before the next election.
Well, I think things that maximize turnout are beneficial, and I think the idea that we had a lot of people streaming out to the end, whether or not it was encouraged by reporting from the East, is a useful sign and a useful development that we had all of these people appear. And I think the idea that not so much about who got Florida and who didn't, but the idea that this election was turning out to be as close as people said it might be, had some sort of impact. In terms of the Sizemore effect, which I've mentioned a couple of times, and Lars just pointed out, head of the Oregon AFL-CIO suggests that in this election, with those things on the ballot, they got 100,000 more voters from union households turning out than they had last time. Now, that's fine if you're Al Gore, but if you're Kevin Mannix and you're sitting there short by 20,000, or Snodgrass and you're short by 30,000, what are you thinking about Bill Sizemore's claim to be advancing the Republican Party in this state?
I'm Martha Maroney, City Club member. I'd like to ask a question that's not so much concerned with civics or partisan politics, but journalism. I think whatever political stripe we're of, we would agree this is a good story. Consider you have the born-again Buchanan voters. You have Jesse Jackson, who's come down to help clarify things. You have Brother Jeb, who, in public at least, is about as fond of his big brother George W. as Hillary is of Bill. And then you have that other guy. What's his name? Nader? Seen fleeing the scene of the crime, blood all over his hands, and nobody's paying him any attention. Well, how would you rank a story like this in terms of its size? And I'm going to ask you to predict a little bit, not just now, but what's going to happen with it, against the following: Elian, Monica, OJ, and Tanya.
Well, of course it's not as big as Tanya. I mean, Tanya was ours. You got to have some perspective in these things. But, I've always had two measures to rank these things. The first is that there was a special size type that was developed and used once by the New York Times, for which reason it's called men walk on moon type. I don't think it's quite like that. No, the second level is during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the New York Times had 8-column banner headlines across the front page for 8 days in a row. And I don't think we're quite at that either. But in terms of the general run of stories, this one's pretty good.
Yeah, I'd have to say this one ranks, it just blows all the rest of them out of the water. It's absolutely, we were talking today, a couple of reporter friends and I, about the fact that this will be really the benchmark against which elections from this point forward will be measured, and in the same way that the Northwest measures many events from the Bhagwan. If you remember him, there were a lot of things that said since he got here or since he left were the two sort of before Bhagwan and after Bhagwan. And then there was before Mount St. Helens and after Mount St. Helens, since that changed the landscape. This too will change the landscape. I'm sure you'll hear at least one serious effort to eliminate the Electoral College, and I think that'll go down in flames. I think states like Oregon will appreciate the value of the Electoral College, and if you don't, let me give you one little anecdotal reference. At 5:27 p.m. on Tuesday night, the Vice President of the United States, Albert Gore, picked up the phone and called KXL's newsroom, unsolicited, unscheduled, unexpected, and said, "Hi." I mean, I don't know what the specific words were, but "Hi, I'll go on the air with you if you want." Now, I'm sure there was a front person who actually called ahead of his call, but none of this was expected. And the reason that on election night, somebody like the Vice President of the United States was calling one newsroom in one radio station in one city in a state with 1% of the nation's population is that we had the Electoral College. If we had not, he would have been calling LA in all likelihood, but it looked as though he already had a lock on that. And Oregon, with its 7 little electoral votes, could have been, if things had rolled out differently, if Florida had gone one way or the other, and if other states had gone other directions, Oregon could be in exactly the position that Florida is in today and be the linchpin of this entire election. Didn't happen that way, but I think Al Gore knew that that was a possibility, and he didn't know how it was going to roll out, and he picked up the phone and started calling newsrooms in Oregon. I mean, something that you don't even usually see Oregon state candidates doing. So
we had to tell the Vice President to stop bothering us, in fact. It was election night, we were busy, we had a paper to put out.
Don Spiegel, City Club member. I'd like to address again the role of the media. Last week on Larry King, Andy Rooney, who's another pundit, said that the American public is basically dumb and uneducated, the electorate. And specifically on your roles and media role, Mr. Sarasohn, your column is fairly academic and
sometimes.
I didn't come here to be insulted.
Are you talking about his cooking column or the political
Correct.
one?
We resemble that remark, right? And that is the old style. Mr. Larson, talk radio is a growing medium, and callers to talk radio who may or may not be experts in their field go on the radio and come out with an anecdotal fact, and that is accepted as fact among a growing section of the public.
Oh,
So
I would strongly disagree with you. And let me tell you why. It is true that people can call up and assert things. The problem is, or not the problem, the beautiful thing about today's technological world is that if somebody calls me and says, that ballot's illegal, it says so in the Florida law, I can have the Florida law in front of me in about 50 seconds. And I often do. I'll pull things up on the internet, and I can go to the Oregon State Revised Statutes, the ORS, and have those laws right in front of me. In the past, you couldn't do that, and it's very difficult to get on talk radio and assert anything and not have it instantly checked, if not by me, then by 1,000 of the people who are listening to the show who will instantly call to correct that person if the information's wrong. It's got a much bigger self-checking factor built into it these days than it used to. And I mean, David and I both do about the same kind of thing because he writes an opinion piece, I do an opinion show. And I think that there are times where the newspapers and the straight radio newscasts and television newscasts don't reflect what people are talking about. I mean, you look at the newscast and you listen to what people are actually talking about, and sometimes reporters hit the mark and sometimes they don't. And I think that the beauty of talk radio is it is a free format where people can weigh in and they can be a little stupid or they can ask a stupid question. Sometimes it's the stupid question that makes a lot more sense than all the high-flown rhetoric of the pundits out there. Well,
I'm certainly not prepared to cede the stupid demographic to Lars. We have many thousands of those readers, and we're proud of them.
But enough about
I think, I think that aside from talk radio, and I think people can pull out examples of things that appear on some shows that are remarkable and that don't get corrected. But I think the amount of information out there now is really vast and increasing. And it's not only newspapers and not only talk radio, but there's just a huge amount of material on the internet, and much of it is actually accurate. There's the various cable television stations. I mean, the idea that we have now, 3 all news, all the time cable networks in terms of the level of awareness of the American public is vast. And, you go out campaigning with congressmen, and they will tell you that, ever since the appearance of C-SPAN, I mean, people ask them questions in the most remote hamlets in their state that they would previously get just from Washington lobbyists. So I think the level of awareness and the level of information out there is really vast.
Next question.
The received wisdom of the graybeards right now appears to be that if there's a revote in Palm Beach County, it will tear the country apart. My impression is that right now the American public is united as ever before around their television sets watching this fascinating spectacle. And if there's a revote in Palm Beach County, the American people will watch that fascinating spectacle and be prepared to abide by the result. On the other hand, if the election is decided by 3,000 votes, which even Pat Buchanan acknowledges are not his, I'm very afraid that those little old ladies in Palm Beach County will tear the country apart with their bare hands. So my question is, if George Bush is a man of honor and is truly a uniter, not a divider, isn't it incumbent on him, wouldn't you agree, to call for a revote in Palm Beach County and agree to abide by the result?
And the quick answer to that is no, and there's a good reason why. There's a good reason why there is and I wish I'd brought the decision with me, but in 25 years ago, there was a revote in New Hampshire because New Hampshire had a Senate election that was so seriously screwed up that the U.S. Senate voted to say we reject the results, revote. And they revoted the entire decision. Now, if you want to go through an entire revote of the whole question of George Bush or Al Gore, I guess so. Crank it up. It'll be good for ratings. But if you want to really create chaos, then suggest that if any level of mistakes or malfeasance, in this case by Democratic Party officials who ran the elections department of Palm Beach County, that if you can detect any level of wrongdoing, then you must have a revote. The law, as I understand it from the lawyers I've talked to, says unless you can show that there was a deliberate attempt to sabotage the election, usually by people involved in the outcome of that election, mistakes happen and they go behind us, and if you don't detect a mistake ahead of time, like that ballot that was published and available, tough. There was a request by a number of candidates in one of the counties in Florida. I've got a copy of the appeals court decision on it, and the court, after it got past all the legal language, had a really interesting little statement about what voters are allowed to do and what candidates can expect. And they said you don't have a right as a candidate to expect to be any place on the ballot. You will be put on the ballot, and voters will be afforded an